Hi everybody, this is Stephen Pugh, City and Guilds Carpentry and Joinery course. We're going to be taking a look at a new unit today. This is Chapter 4, Unit 212, which is setting out and marking out bench joinery products. Now I do realise that sometimes the bench joinery guys feel that this is entirely exclusively for them, and that's okay. But the side guys, you need to also just be knowing about these things. You don't have to necessarily practice it, but you certainly have to know about it. When I began as a joiner, I had the privilege of being involved in a workshop that also went out and did external works. So in the workshop we would make things, make doors, we'd make staircases, we'd do all of that. We'd also make lots of products, but then we would also go out and fit products. So I had a lot of time going out on site doing roofing, going out on site doing fencing, all those types of things. And also then they'd say, oh, by the way, Stephen, you're in the workshop tomorrow, so I'd be immediately back on my bench again. The two disciplines are quite separate in many senses. Some people never ever hang a door because they just make the doors. However, as a joiner, it's very good if you can have some experience in both fields. If you're a site worker, a site carpenter, then you really need to just get yourself into a workshop sometime and spend a month or two there just to be able to understand that side of things. And if you're a bench joiner, then go out there and experience site work. You may find it very, very bewildering initially when you move into the different fields, but they're very complementary of one another. Now in this video we're talking about the setting out and marking out of bench joinery products, and the first thing we need to understand is working drawings. Now a working drawing for a bench joiner means a full-size rod. Now a full-size rod sometimes is a large sheet in which say for example you have a circular headed door. That door will be carefully drawn out in full size, but most of the time a rod will be a long strip of plywood or blockboard in which a section of something that you're making, like for example the section of a window or the section of a door, typically will be drawn out in detail with a very sharp pencil onto that rod. That gives you the opportunity to be able to check those sizes and make sure that everything is perfectly correct. In fact, in the workshop where I was originally trained, in the corner there were lots of rods. Very often they'd be hanging on nails, but sometimes they'd just be standing in the corner, and we would go out with a sheet of plywood, say about 4 inches wide and about say 6 foot long, and with that wood we would put it into the window and we would put marks on it. It didn't really matter to us what the measurement was. In fact, sometimes we never actually knew what the measurement was because we used the rod as a means of telling us the width of the window. Then we would turn it around and put it the other side vertically and get the overall height, and we'd mark it very carefully, and that then would be the basis of everything that we did in the workshop. So we'd take that rod to the workshop, there'd be the name of the person, the date, all the details written onto it. Sometimes there'd be the cutting list written on it, and that became our working device to enable us to work everything out. We would draw out the complete window or the complete door onto that rod, and then we would then put the timber onto the rod and mark up to where the marks would be on the timber. Now this eliminates a great deal of errors that can occur. It's very, very important that we get into the habit of using rods. There was a little tip which I discovered which was very interesting in one company. They were very computerized. So they had everything on computer and they worked everything out on computer, and that's great, it's fantastic. However, the thing I learned was running measurements, and that was very, very helpful. So for example, down a piece of timber, if you can imagine a piece of timber for a door, first of all you'd have 3 or 4 inches of offcut at the top. That would be called a horn. Then there would then be the top rail, then there would then be the space between the top rail and the middle, then there'd be the middle rail, and so on down the line. Now let's suppose the numbers were 100 for the waist, 170 for the top rail, 300 for the top panel, 50 for a middle rail, 300 again for a bottom panel, and then 170 for the bottom rail, and then 100 millimeters. Now instead of taking a tape measure, our rule, and marking them off one by one down the timber, we would use running measurements. So we'd put the tape measure on the top and we'd mark at 100. Then we would then mark from the same tape measure 270. You say, why is that, Stephen? Because 270 is the 100 and the 170 top rail added together mathematically. Then we'd add on the 300, which means that I'd mark it then at 570, then I'd mark it at 620, I'd mark it at 920, 1090, and then 1190. Now what that meant was, because the rule never moved, and because there was no discrepancy between all the individual measurements, it meant that I could get exact measurements onto the timber of the different positions of things down the stile. Now that's an exceptionally important tip, and I now use that method all the time. The other thing that you will have on a site very often, on a workbench very often, is what's called the job sheet. So this is just a sheet of paper, or maybe a piece of card, so it doesn't get screwed up. And it would have the customer's name, it would have the date, it would have a description of the work to be carried out, and also it would have any other further instructions. And so you'd work from the worksheet. In fact, in some companies I've been to, the worksheet becomes also the list of the time spent on the job. Okay, it also is the list of all the materials being used, taken from the stack. So this job sheet becomes an exceptionally important tool. And for some reason, when I sit down here to do a video, I become my mouth becomes dry. So let me just do a drink of water. Okay, now one of the other things, source of information you need to become familiar with is what's called the building regulations. And this is a very important thing that we need to do. Building regulations part K specifies how items of joinery are to be made. They're to be made in such a way that they properly and adequately fulfill their purpose and also remain consistent with the building regulations. And then there's other information sources. We talked about them earlier in the course. There's specifications, there's schedules, and there's manufacturer's technical documentation. Now all these items of information have to be collected before the job is even thought about. The next thing we really need to do when we're working, and I tend to be a little bit pessimistic when I'm marking out, the big thing we need to do is to check everything. Check and check and check and check. On one occasion, for example, I went to make a door for somebody, and there's a habit amongst joiners to put your tape measure on the 100 millimeter mark and then put the measurements down the timber. Now I did that, and I did that consistently, and I produced a lovely door. It was beautiful, it was perfect, and when I delivered it to the customer, I found that it was 100 millimeters short in height. Now you see, that just goes to show that a simple practice that we have can actually throw us off, and we can do something that's a mistake. Now if you're making any mistakes in your joinery products, you might discover that there is a penalty clause for work that's being done late. These penalty clauses can be quite substantial. If it's a big project like a house or an extension, you might have a penalty clause of £150 a week, which goes up to £500 a week after 2 months. You know, these penalty clauses are written into contracts. This is why it's so very important that we actually check information. We check and we double check and we double check. The way in which I check and double check is I normally will mark and measure everything out in metric, and then I put all that away, go and sleep on it, and then I come and check it all in imperial. And sometimes a problem occurs. Sometimes you think, that's not quite adding up, and then you discover that your original check-in was not correct. So checking something's very important. If you're going to make a staircase and you're going to charge £200, £300 or £400 for a staircase, you need to make sure that it'll fit. It's no good having the staircase brought in, put it in, and it's actually 30 millimeters incorrect in height. See, these things can occur. And what we do as carpenters is spend all our time trying to stop errors from occurring. Of course, you can never really stop all errors from occurring. There's always a mistake that can be made somehow, but the purpose of a joiner, and a really good joiner, is somebody not that makes a mistake specifically, but is able to get around the mistake and find a way of continuing. So cutting lists and ironmongery, they're the next thing that need to be checked. Now, a cutting list for timber is a very simple thing, but I'm going to give you a little tip here at the end. Obviously on your cutting list you've got the item number, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and then it's a component, so it may say stiles, top rail, middle rail, okay? And then on the next stage it may say redwood, redwood, redwood. It might say mahogany, mahogany, mahogany. See, depends on the particular timber that you're going to be using. And then the next one then is how many. So if you're going to use stiles, then you're going to need 2, so it's 2 stiles, and then you're going to need a top rail, which is just the 1, and then the middle and the bottom rail, well, we'll need 2 of those. See, and a simple doorway, that's how it goes. And then you have length, and then you have nominal width and nominal thickness. Now, I always get very muddled up about this in the early days. What does nominal mean? Well, it's a French word. It just means in name only. So, for example, if you're doing the top rail, if you're doing the stiles on this fictitious door, then you might find that you'll be using 100 by 50 stock, which is the name of the timber that you're going to use out of the wood pile. Okay, but then you have 2 other measurements. So you then have finished width and finished thickness. That might be 95 by 45. See that? But I have another little tip here. And very often when I'm working with a lot of timber, it can be quite confusing, very confusing in fact. And what I do is I call them by letters. So for example, these 2 stiles they're 95 by 45, but there's other components that also are 95 by 45. So what I will do is I will give them a letter A or a letter B, and I will normally get a felt pen and write on the end of the timber. You know where the end of the timber comes through? I'll get a felt pen and write on it. Now the reason for that is that when I'm machining material, I can just take the material, look at the end, oh, this is an A piece. Let's make all the A's now. So we make all the A's at 95 by 45. Then say, right, they're all done. Now let's do all the B's. Because irrespective of what components they are, that tells me that they're all the same size. And that helps me to understand what I'm doing. Anybody can get muddled at this stage. The next stage is a requisition order. Now, sometimes when you're working on a job, there's certain things that you require, certain things that you request. So a requisition order then is a request that goes to a supplier. It might be asking for locks, it might be asking for hinges, it might be asking for the timber involved, it might be asking for some paint. It doesn't matter what it is. It's called a requisition order, and it's something to be filled in to request goods. Now the next thing we need to think about is the various tools for setting out. And on this particular occasion, I'm going to talk about I'm just going to run down the list. Most of these things you're very familiar with, but we'll just talk about them. Setting out tools. I've got some of the setting out tools with me, so this is a little bit like Blue Peter today, isn't it? This is one I made earlier. Well, not made earlier, but this is one I had earlier. A typical setting out rule might look like this. And you'll notice that on this particular rule, the numbers are given for different scales. So this is a scale rule, and this means that I'm able to work from a plan into real life, but I would use it sometimes just as an ordinary rule. Okay, the next one then is a tape measure. I don't need to show you what a tape measure looks like, do I? And then the next thing is a T-square. It is a typical T-square. This is the one that comes, I went into my workshop today and fetched them out. There's a typical T-square. This I will use when I'm marking out a rod, and it slides up the side of it and does parallel lines, which is obviously very, very useful indeed. On top of that, I might also use set squares. Set squares. These are called set squares. I heard somebody the other day talking about a combination square as being a set square. No, these are set squares, and of course you have them in different sizes, and they also have different angles. Sometimes they're 45, sometimes they're 30-60. Okay, so all these devices are good. There's a little scale rule that I've had for quite a long time. I even drew a hole in it so I could hang it up to know where it was. The next one then is a combination square. You all know what a combination square is. It's a square where the blade can actually slide up and down the device. And also a roofing square. Now, roofing squares are a large piece of steel. I've got mine in the shed now, and they are used with timber going across them so that they can be clamped together, and you can get specific triangle shapes. So when you're working out things like staircases or you're working out roofs, then that triangle shape is absolutely ideal for working out the angles. And then of course another little tool, there's my sliding bevel, simple little tool. It slides out. You probably all have seen one of these. I use this far more than people realise. I use it for all sorts of angles. Sometimes I just want to pick it up, put it on something square and turn it into a useful square that I can use for marking off timber. Okay, a protractor, very simple thing really. All these things are very obvious really, or fairly obvious, and they're all used for the marking out of jobs in the workshop. Now, very often people talk about using a compass. Now, I don't have a compass in the traditional way. This is my compass. So this has been designed by me. I've taken out the shaft of a normal marking gauge, and I've put a small screw into there and made it nice and sharp, and I can put a pencil into this other end here. Okay, and then what I can do, I can then undo this screw and I can adjust this to whatever size I want, and then that becomes then a compass. I can hold it at that position and go around in circles. So this is my compass. By the way, I do have quite a lot of these tools. They're really useful. I've got one that's 6'6" long. It's just a piece of timber that's that long. The thing itself, the stock itself, remains the same size all the time. But you can actually adapt your tools and make your tools to fit what it is that you're doing. Sometimes that's called a trammel head and beam. But I call it a marking gauge really. Then of course there's pencils. Do I need to tell you what a pencil looks like? I don't think so. Another thing that you might come into contact with is a thing called CAD, which is computer aided design. Now in computer aided design, it's possible to do all the work on a computer in 3 dimensions, okay, and then you're able to then print off either in full scale or in scale the plans that you need. Now I'm old-fashioned, so I don't know that much about computer-aided design, but yeah, it's something that exists, something I'd love to be involved in one day, but have not been involved just yet. One of the things that you need to really understand in carpentry and joinery is that there is certain very basic geometry involved, certainly the geometry of circles. It's something you need to just get a compass and play about with and learn how to get a 30 degrees, how to get a 40 degrees and so on. And also how to bisect angles, how to make angles be divided into 2. You might have a particular angle on some skirting that's actually quite a narrow angle. You want to be able to find out the mitre between the 2. Well, it's some very simple geometry that's involved in doing something like that. It's something really to play with yourself and to have a go. Now the next thing we need to talk about when we're talking about marking out is using gauges. Now we have the marking gauge, the mortise gauge, and let me just show you some of them. This is my This is my favourite. This is the one that I now have used more than anything in the workshop, and it's a beautiful little device. Okay. You can see that it has two stems, and you can undo the top one and it'll slide out, so slide forward like this. See that? And instead of having a little nail as a spur, it has a little wheel that revolves. Okay, so as it's being used, as it goes down the timber, so it doesn't snag, but it rolls nice and smoothly. These are beautiful little tools, and I use this one all the time when I'm working in my workshop. Now, I understand that not everybody has that type, so I'll show you the traditional types as well. I do have traditional type marking gauges. Let me see when I've got one. There we are. Now there's a very traditional marking gauge. This one, funnily enough, is not just a marking gauge. It's actually a, there we are, just move it a little bit. It's actually a mortise gauge as well. So let me tell you what the different parts of a marking gauge are called. The different parts are called, this is called the stock. It's the main body of the marking gauge. This is called the stem. It's a little bit like the stem of a flower. This is called the screw, and this here is called the spur. And of course, on a marking gauge, you have a spur on one side and you have two spurs on the other side, but don't worry about all that. And the way in which it's used is this, is that this cannot be used at all unless the timber is already marked with the face side and face edge. So for example, this is a little square I use, but I'll use this as an example. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to use a felt pen to mark it, and you'll see exactly what I mean. So on this particular timber, if I have that as the face edge and this as the face side, you see the two there? Face side and face edge. Now it isn't possible, strictly speaking, to use a marking gauge without those markings set up. So at the very beginning of any marking operation, it's very important to use to mark up the timber with the face side and face edge. Very, very important, right from the very beginning. You can't really use any tools without having that. And the particular point is, you say, why, Stephen? Why is that so? Because the stock, okay, which is this part, must always be on the face edge or on the face side. Okay, it can't be on the back side or the back edge. It must always be on the face side or the face edge. That's very, very important. Very, very important. And so that's something which a lot of people are sort of a little bit unaware of. Now, obviously, the squares. Squares are used for marking out. I don't need to show you what a tri-square looks like. I think pretty well everybody has got one. Just remember that with most woodworking tri-squares, most of them will not be true square. Okay, that's a bit of a shock, I know, and you think that they should automatically be square, but if you put two of them together, you know, and you'll see whether they actually are perfectly square with each other. Or you can just have a single one, put it on some timber, put a mark, turn it around and do the mark again, and you'll find that they're not necessarily square. So what do we do about that? Well, what I do is I go down to the engineering department and I purchase an engineer's square, and these will be absolutely perfectly square. There's other squares that you can have as well. For example, you can have a little dovetail square. You can have mitre squares, although I've never really had a need for a dedicated mitre square myself. I would always use a combination square if I needed it. And you can also have what's called a box square. Now this particular box square was made by me. Can you see? It's a piece of timber, piece of mahogany as it happens, and a piece of plastic. And the two are put together. And when I'm marking timber, I can put this on the timber, slide it along, put a mark on the top and the side, slide it along top side, so it'll actually give two marks at the same time. This speeds up the marking process when we're marking timber. Of course, we talk about using pencils when we're marking timber, but if you're doing accurate work, then a little marking knife would be better. Now you can actually buy dedicated marking knives, but occasionally I've made my own, and occasionally I will use an ordinary butter knife. Get a butter knife from the kitchen, one that hasn't been used, and put the angle on it and sharpen it up, and it'll be absolutely ideal for marking. The great thing about using a marking gauge on a marking knife on the edge of timber is that you're able to peel it back a tiny bit, and you're able to get your saw to just start on that marking line, and that will give you an exceptionally sharp and exceptionally accurate mark. So if I've rattled through all this quite quickly, there's an awful lot to setting out, but didn't want to make it too long, so we're going to pick up the same subject on the next video. Oh, by the way, just before I go, I've just noticed in front of me is this. Now this is a beautiful tool. This is a pair of dividers, and you can see that you can spin that and open them out, and what you can do is when you're working, you can actually turn them around and you can work out measurements very, very accurately. You could use it as a compass if you really wanted to, but something like this is absolutely superb for marking out. There we are. So look forward to seeing you on the next video. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.